A millionaire rescues a homeless mother and child in the middle of a hurricane and takes them home. But they never know. The woman is... The snowstorm had completely engulfed the world, erasing the boundaries of the familiar. Harold Tucker gripped the steering wheel of his sleek sedan, his knuckles pale under the cold glow of the dashboard. The heated leather seat beneath him was an empty comfort, like most things in his life. Outside, the wind howled, flinging icy daggers against his windshield, and the headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the thick, swirling snow. The road, a pale ribbon in the storm's teeth, extended endlessly ahead. He had driven this way countless times, returning to the Tucker mansion perched on its hill like a fortress. Tonight, though, the silence pressed heavier. He glanced at the empty passenger seat, the faint leather scent mingling with the bitter tang of his thoughts. Harold's life had been carved from success, deals signed, fortunes amassed, but its contours were cold and sharp. The mansion, the empire, the prestige, all as hollow as the swirling storm outside. Even the house he was returning to felt more like a monument to his achievements than a home. The car's tires slid slightly as he rounded a bend, his heart lurching with the slip. He eased off the gas, the sudden jolt snapping him into sharper focus. The road ahead was barely visible, but just as he squinted through the storm, something emerged, a shadow stumbling near the edge of the road. Harold's heart thudded as he braked, the car shuddering to a halt. In the harsh glare of the headlights stood a woman, wrapped in a thin coat that clung to her frame. She shielded her face with one arm, the other clutching a bundle to her chest. Her steps were uneven, her figure swaying under the storm's relentless force. Harold hesitated, his hand hovering over the steering wheel. It would be easier to drive on, to dismiss her as someone else's problem. But then, the bundle in her arms shifted, and the faint, sharp cry of an infant sliced through the wind. He rolled down the window, icy air biting at his face. "Hey!" he called out, his voice muffled by the storm. She froze, her face turning toward him, eyes wide and dark beneath a tangle of wet hair. "You'll freeze out here. Get in!" The woman didn't move, her expression caught between desperation and suspicion. The baby whimpered again, its fragile cry almost lost in the howling wind. Harold leaned closer to the window, his tone softening. "Please, it's too cold. You've got a child with you." Still, she hesitated, her body tense as if she might bolt. Harold sighed, pulling the car into park and opening the door. The wind rushed in, tugging at his coat. "I'm not going to hurt you. You need to get her somewhere warm." That seemed to break through her caution. With a reluctant nod, she approached, clutching the bundle tighter. Harold stepped back as she slid into the passenger seat, the infant shielded against the blast of cold. She winced as the door shut, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks. The faint scent of damp wool and fear clung to her. Harold turned the heat up, letting the car hum around them. "Name's Harold," he said, keeping his voice steady and neutral. "Natalie?" she replied, her voice low and hoarse. She adjusted the blanket around the baby, glancing at him briefly, before her eyes darted back to her daughter. "And this is Amber." Harold nodded, his gaze flickering to the tiny face peeking from the folds of fabric. Red-cheeked and squirming, the child's eyes fluttered open briefly, then shut against the warmth of the car. "How old?" "3 months," Natalie murmured, brushing a hand over Amber's head. Her fingers were trembling, not from cold, but something deeper. He put the car in gear, easing back onto the road. "Where were you headed?" "Anywhere but here," she said quietly, the words almost lost beneath the rhythm of the windshield wipers. Harold didn't press her. The edge in her voice was as sharp as the storm outside, a barrier he instinctively knew not to penetrate. They drove in silence, the storm's fury muffled by the cocoon of the car. Harold glanced at her occasionally, noting the defiance in her posture despite her exhaustion. Her eyes never left Amber. The mansion loomed ahead, its lights cutting through the swirling snow like a beacon. For the first time in years, Harold felt the weight of its emptiness. As he turned into the long driveway, he glanced at Natalie. She was staring at the house, her face unreadable. "Just for tonight," Harold said quietly, sensing her unease. "To get you both warm." Natalie didn't respond, but she nodded, her grip on Amber tightening. The house swallowed them as they stepped inside, the storm closing its jaws behind them. The Tucker mansion loomed ahead, its sharp-edged silhouette cutting through the storm like an indifferent sentinel. Natalie held Amber tighter, her fingers clutching the fraying edges of the baby's blanket. The heat of Harold's car had begun to thaw her limbs, but the chill inside her chest hadn't budged. The towering iron gates creaked open, and the driveway stretched like a black tongue, leading to the estate's heart. Harold pulled the car to a smooth stop beneath a sprawling awning. "Stay here," he said, his voice low, businesslike. Natalie nodded, watching him step into the flurry, the storm pulling at his coat as he strode toward the front door. She took a moment to steady her breath, glancing at Amber, who had drifted into an uneasy sleep. The faint rise and fall of her chest was the only thing grounding Natalie in the unfamiliarity surrounding her. When the front doors swung open, a rush of warm, amber light spilled into the night. Harold returned and opened the car door. "Come on," he said, his hand motioning her inside. Natalie hesitated only a second before climbing out, the sharp wind slapping her face as she hurried into the mansion's glowing mouth. Inside, the contrast was immediate and overwhelming. Polished marble floors stretched endlessly underfoot, their gleam reflecting the glow of an immense chandelier that cascaded from the vaulted ceiling above. Tall windows framed by heavy velvet drapes reached toward the heavens, though the storm outside rendered them black mirrors. The air was warm, faintly scented with cedar and aged leather, but it held an almost clinical sterility. No trace of home, just wealth and distance. "You can set her down if you need to," Harold said, gesturing toward a sofa that looked more like a museum piece than a place to rest. Natalie shook her head. "She's fine, like this," she replied, her voice measured but firm. She didn't miss the way Harold's gaze lingered on Amber, softening for just a moment before he cleared his throat. Footsteps approached, deliberate and steady. Natalie turned toward the sound as a man entered the room, a tall figure with hair touched by silver, his suit impeccable even at this late hour. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over her, resting momentarily on Amber before returning to her face. "Father," Harold said, his tone polite but distant. "This is Natalie. She and her daughter needed shelter from the storm." Wayne Tucker's expression flickered, with something Natalie couldn't name. Wariness, perhaps, or faint disapproval. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a mask of civility. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth but cool. "This weather is unforgiving. You're fortunate Harold found you." "Thank you," Natalie replied, her words clipped. She adjusted Amber slightly, her grip instinctively tightening under Wayne's gaze. There was no hostility in his demeanor, but there was something guarded, a subtle distance that set her on edge. Wayne nodded toward Harold. "I'll have Lorna prepare the guest room," he said. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing faintly until they disappeared into silence. Natalie exhaled slowly, tension knotting her shoulders. "I don't want to trouble anyone," she murmured, more to herself than to Harold. He glanced at her, the line of his jaw tightening briefly before he spoke. "It's no trouble. You need a safe place tonight. She nodded, but didn't look at him, her eyes drawn to the room's details, the massive fireplace crackling with logs, the ornate mirrors reflecting the storm's dim flicker beyond the windows. It was a beautiful space, curated to perfection, but devoid of warmth. The experience was akin to stepping into a meticulously crafted portrait, imprisoned in a timeless moment. "Come on," Harold said, motioning her toward a hallway. "The guest room's this way." She followed, her footsteps barely audible on the thick rugs. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with portraits that seemed to watch as they passed. Harold stopped at a door and pushed it open, revealing a room that was smaller but no less opulent. The bed was enormous, the linens pristine. A crib had already been placed in the corner, its presence a reminder of how swiftly the mansion's staff worked. "Let me know if you need anything," Harold said, lingering in the doorway. His tone was almost awkward, as though he were unused to offering comfort. Natalie nodded, her expression unreadable. As Harold closed the door, the silence settled around her like a shroud. She laid Amber carefully in the crib, brushing a strand of dark hair from her daughter's forehead. The baby stirred, but didn't wake, her soft breaths filling the room. Natalie stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the crib's edge. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her, but the questions it raised pressed harder. What kind of man was Harold Tucker? And what kind of family had she just stepped into? Morning light filtered weakly through the heavy drapes of the guest room, catching on the ornate carvings of the furniture. Natalie stirred, her eyes immediately searching for Amber in the crib. The baby lay peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling in soft rhythm. Natalie slowly sat up, wiping the sleep from her eyes as the events of the previous night rushed back to her. This wasn't her world, and the unfamiliar luxury only deepened her unease. The mansion was quiet as she emerged into the hallway, Amber cradled in her arms. Each step on the thick carpet seemed to absorb sound, amplifying the stillness. She found Harold in the dining room, seated at the far end of a long table, the morning paper folded beside his plate. He looked up as she entered. "Morning," he said simply, standing as though unsure of the etiquette in this situation. "Did you sleep okay?" Natalie hesitated before nodding. "Yes, thank you." Amber was comfortable too. He gestured toward the table. "There's coffee, tea, whatever you need. Lorna can make you something." Natalie shook her head. "I don't want to impose. I can manage on my own." Before Harold could respond, footsteps approached, deliberate and precise. Wayne entered the room, his gaze immediately landing on Natalie. "Good morning," he said, his tone polite but devoid of warmth. "Morning," Natalie replied, her voice steady. She adjusted Amber in her arms, her fingers brushing over the baby's blanket. Wayne's eyes lingered on Amber for a fraction of a second longer than was comfortable. "You'll be staying long?" he asked, addressing Harold, but clearly referring to Natalie. "Just until the weather clears," Harold replied, his tone calm, but with an edge of finality. He glanced at Natalie, his expression unreadable. Wayne nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. He turned his attention back to Natalie. "What was your destination prior to the storm?" She stiffened slightly, but her voice remained composed. "Just moving on. It's been difficult to stay in one place." Wayne's sharp gaze flickered to Amber and back. "Alone?" Natalie hesitated, feeling the weight of his question. "It's just the two of us now," she said finally. "My mother passed a few years ago. My husband wasn't someone we could stay with." Harold straightened, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice softer, tinged with concern. Natalie glanced down at Amber, her fingers tightening on the blanket. "He wasn't a good man." she said simply, as though those few words were enough to explain everything. And they were. The silence that followed was heavy. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his expression conflicted. However, Wayne's face revealed a distinct emotion, shock and possibly recognition. His gaze fixed on Natalie, his posture stiffening. "Your mother," Wayne said, his voice quieter now, almost too measured. "What was her name?" Natalie looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to determine why it mattered. "Helen," she said after a moment. "Helen Avery." Wayne blinked, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. The name landed like a weight between them. His gaze swept over Natalie again, lingering on the slope of her jaw, the curve of her cheekbones. The resemblance was undeniable, but he said nothing. Harold, oblivious to his father's reaction, leaned forward. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "No one should have to go through that. If there's anything you need while you're here—" "I'm fine," Natalie interrupted, her voice firmer now. "You've done enough, really. I just need to keep moving once the storm passes." Wayne remained silent, his expression a carefully composed mask. "If you'll excuse me," he said, abruptly, standing. Without another word, he left the room, his footsteps fading down the hall. Harold watched him go, his brow furrowed. "Don't mind him," he said, turning back to Natalie. "He's complicated." Natalie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she adjusted Amber in her arms again, her fingers brushing over the baby's soft hair. "I should help with something," she said after a moment. "I don't like sitting around while others do everything." Harold frowned slightly. "You don't have to—" "I want to," she said firmly, her eyes meeting his. "Please, just tell me what I can do." He nodded slowly, understanding that arguing wouldn't get him anywhere. "All right, Lorna could use a hand in the kitchen, I'm sure." "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. With a brief smile, she left the dining room, Amber tucked securely against her. Harold watched her go, a strange warmth blooming in the quiet she left behind. There was something about her, a strength beneath the surface, a quiet resilience that drew him in, despite himself. Down the hall, Wayne stood in his study, the door slightly ajar. His hand rested on the back of a chair, his knuckles white. "Helen," he murmured, the name escaping him like a ghost, and in Natalie's face, he couldn't help but see the shadows of a past he'd long tried to bury. Later that day, Harold found himself alone in the mansion's library, a space he seldom visited, but had always admired. The room exuded a quiet authority. Dark mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound books, their spines glinting faintly under the dim light. The storm raged outside, stifling the world beyond the thick-paned windows. Harold ran his fingers absent-mindedly along the spines, pausing at an unmarked book that looked out of place among the pristine collection. He pulled it free, finding it heavier than expected. It wasn't a book at all, but an old staff ledger, its worn leather cover cracked at the corners. Intrigued, Harold opened it and skimmed the handwritten entries inside. Familiar names of gardeners, housekeepers, and other staff passed under his gaze, and then his eyes stopped at one. Helen Avery, housemaid. The name meant nothing to him, though he thought he recognized a faint ring to it, a ghost of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Frowning, he flipped a few more pages, finding no additional details. That's different from other servants. He tucked the ledger under his arm, deciding to ask Wayne about it. Wayne was in the sitting room, a low fire crackling in the hearth. He was staring into the flames, his expression distant, but his posture stiffened slightly when Harold entered. "Do you remember a Helen Avery?" Harold asked, holding up the ledger. Wayne turned slowly, his sharp eyes landing on the book in Harold's hands. His expression flickered, something too quick for Harold to fully catch, before settling into practiced neutrality. "Helen Avery," Wayne repeated, leaning back in his chair. "That was a long time ago." Harold raised an eyebrow, detecting an edge to his father's tone. "You do remember her then?" "There were many people who worked here over the years," Wayne replied, his voice measured. "I don't recall all of them in detail." "She's listed as a housemaid," Harold pressed. "It must have been when I was a child." Wayne's jaw tightened slightly, though his smile remained intact. "Yes, perhaps. I wouldn't expect you to remember. You were quite young. Why the sudden interest?" Harold hesitated, sensing the subtle tension in his father's posture. "Natalie mentioned her mother's name was Helen Avery," he said finally. "I thought it might be the same person." Wayne's expression froze for a fraction of a second before he leaned forward, folding his hands together. "Curious coincidence," he said lightly, though his voice lacked the warmth of genuine amusement. "But as I said, I don't recall much." Harold frowned. Something about Wayne's response felt too rehearsed, as though he had prepared for this conversation long before it happened. But before he could press further, Wayne stood. "If you'll excuse me, I have some work to attend to," he said, brushing past Harold without waiting for a reply. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp and purposeful. Natalie, meanwhile, was in the kitchen, standing awkwardly near the counter as Lorna prepared dinner. Amber was tucked into a sling on Natalie's chest, her small hand occasionally twitching as she dozed. "Are you sure I can't help?" Natalie asked again, her tone soft but insistent. Lorna chuckled, shaking her head. "You're our guest. Just sit and relax." Natalie smiled faintly, but remained standing. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though Lorna was the only one in the room. She turned slightly and caught sight of Wayne in the doorway. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes lingered on her longer than she was comfortable with. "You must be very young to have a child," Wayne said, his voice cutting through the kitchen's quiet hum. Natalie stiffened, instinctively adjusting Amber in her sling. "I'm 25, she said evenly. Wayne nodded, his expression unreadable. "And how long ago did your mother pass?" Natalie hesitated. 3 years ago, she said finally. Wayne seemed to calculate something, his brow furrowing slightly before his face smoothed over again. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, but his voice was distant, distracted. He glanced at Amber briefly before excusing himself and disappearing down the hall. As he walked away, his mind churned. 25 years ago. That would make her birth. His steps faltered momentarily before resuming. The timeline was too close, too precise to ignore. In the library, Harold flipped through the ledger again, his thoughts circling back to Natalie and her quiet strength. Something about her story, her determination, her protective grip on Amber, stuck with him, a sharp contrast to the sterility of his own world. He didn't hear Wayne enter the room until the door clicked shut behind him. "Leave it alone," Wayne said flatly. Harold looked up, startled. "What?" "The past. It's better left undisturbed." Wayne's voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed a shadow of unease. Harold stared at his father, the pieces refusing to fit neatly together. For the first time in years, he wondered just how much Wayne was keeping from him. And why? The morning light softened the storm's remnants, casting a pale glow over the sprawling estate. Harold stood in the nursery, his hand hovering over the crib where Amber lay cooing softly. She was awake, her tiny hands swatting at the air as if she were trying to catch invisible threads of sunlight. Harold hesitated, unsure, before finally leaning over to pick her up. "Hey there, little one," he murmured awkwardly, cradling her with the stiffness of a man unpracticed in tenderness. Amber blinked up at him, her wide, unguarded gaze disarming. Harold's lips twitched into a rare smile. In the doorway, Natalie watched silently, her arms crossed. The sight of Harold holding Amber was surprising, almost jarring. There was an earnestness in his expression, a quiet care she hadn't expected. It softened something in her chest that she had kept tightly bound since the storm had thrust them into this house. "You're better at that than I thought," she said lightly, stepping into the room. Harold glanced at her, startled, and then huffed a self-deprecating laugh. "I wouldn't count on that. She's the first baby I've ever held." Natalie arched an eyebrow. "Really?" "Really," he replied, shifting Amber slightly. "Babies weren't exactly part of my world." Natalie's gaze softened. "Well, you're doing fine. She seems to like you." Amber gurgled as if in agreement, her small fingers reaching up to clutch at Harold's tie. He chuckled, and for a fleeting moment, the tension that usually shadowed him seemed to dissolve. Meanwhile, Wayne stood by the large bay window in his study, watching the gardens outside as if they held answers to his restless thoughts. Helen's name, Natalie's age, the familiar contours of her face. They swirled together, forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. The timeline fit too perfectly. It had been 25 years since Helen had left, her departure abrupt and shrouded in silence. Wayne rubbed a hand over his face, his composure cracking for a moment. Revealing the truth would tear open wounds, long scarred over. But every glance at Natalie, every interaction, chipped away at his resolve. The guilt he had buried deep within him now clawed its way to the surface, refusing to be ignored. In the library, Natalie found herself cleaning shelves alongside Lorna. It was a small gesture, but she couldn't stand idleness. The house overwhelmed her. Its grandeur was suffocating, a constant reminder that she didn't belong. As she worked, her fingers brushed against the edge of an old ledger tucked between two books. "What's this?" she murmured, pulling it free. Lorna glanced over. "Oh, that's ancient. Something to do with the staff from decades ago. Mr. Harold was flipping through it yesterday, but he left it here." Curiosity piqued, Natalie opened the ledger and scanned the names. Familiar handwriting filled the pages, though the ink was faded with time. Her heart stopped when her mother's name leapt out at her. Helen Avery, housemaid. She stared at the name, her mind racing. Her mother had mentioned working for a wealthy family before Natalie was born, but she'd spoken little of it. Natalie had always assumed it was a distant, unrelated chapter of Helen's life. The weight of the connection now pressed against her chest like a vice. "Natalie?" Lorna's voice broke through her thoughts. "You all right, dear?" Natalie quickly closed the ledger, nodding. "Yeah, just surprised, I guess." She didn't elaborate, though her thoughts spun wildly. She had to know more. Later that evening, Harold found her in the library, the ledger still clutched in her hands. He approached cautiously, noting the furrow in her brow. "Something on your mind?" he asked, gesturing towards the book. Natalie hesitated before handing it to him. "This was my mother's name. Helen Avery." Harold blinked, startled. He flipped through the pages again, this time with more focus. "She worked here." His voice held disbelief. "I don't remember her. She said she worked for a wealthy family, but she never mentioned—" "This," Natalie replied, her tone low, almost to herself. "She never talked about it much at all." Harold frowned, the pieces still refusing to come together. "Did she ever say why she left?" Natalie shook her head. "Only that it was sudden, and that it was painful." Harold's frown deepened. "I asked my father about her. He said he doesn't remember much." "Doesn't he?" Natalie's voice carried a sharp edge, her suspicion growing. "He seems to remember everything else." Harold glanced at her, startled by her tone, But before he could respond, footsteps approached. Wayne entered the room, his presence casting an immediate pall over the conversation. "You've been busy," he said, his eyes flicking to the ledger in Harold's hands. Although his tone was calm, his razor-sharp gaze briefly locked onto Natalie. Natalie straightened, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance. "It's just a name," she said, her voice steady but laced with an unspoken challenge. "But I think it meant something." Wayne's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to Harold. "We've discussed this. Leave it alone." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the air between Harold and Natalie heavy with unanswered questions. "What is he so afraid of?" Natalie murmured. Harold didn't answer. Harold sat in the library late that evening, the ledger lying unopened on the table in front of him. The questions Natalie had raised lingered like a shadow over the room. He leaned back in the leather armchair, his gaze drifting to the flickering fireplace. Natalie's defiance, Wayne's tension, it all hinted at something he couldn't grasp. She found him there, her presence quiet but charged with purpose. "Do you have a moment?" Natalie asked, holding Amber in her arms. The baby had fallen asleep, her tiny fingers curled against Natalie's shoulder. Harold gestured to the seat opposite him. Of course. Natalie hesitated before sitting, her movements careful as not to wake Amber. "I've been thinking about this," she said, nodding toward the ledger. "About my mother and this house, and I need to know if there's more." Harold rubbed his temples, then dropped his hands to his lap. "I don't remember, Helen. Honestly, I don't. I must have been too young." Natalie's eyes narrowed slightly, skeptical. "You don't remember any of the staff? No one from back then?" Harold sighed. "I was a child. People came and went. I didn't pay much attention." She leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "But what about your family? Did anything happen around that time? Did anyone leave suddenly?" Harold's gaze flickered. The edges of a memory stirred, faint but insistent. "We used to live with my aunt and uncle," he said slowly. "Grace and Randy. They moved out around that time. It was sudden." Natalie's expression grew sharper. "Why did they leave?" "I don't know," Harold admitted, his brow furrowing. "No one ever explained it to me. My mother wouldn't allow anyone to talk about them after they left." Natalie's grip on Amber tightened slightly, her thoughts racing. The timelines, the secrecy, there were too many coincidences. She studied Harold's face, searching for any sign of withheld knowledge, but he seemed genuinely puzzled. "You're sure you don't remember anything else?" she pressed. "I wish I did," Harold said, his voice quieter. "But if there's something here, I want to figure it out too." Wayne sat alone in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey resting on the desk before him. The house was quiet, save for the faint creaks of its old bones settling into the night. He stared at the amber liquid, the firelight refracting through the glass and painting fractured patterns on the walls. Helen's name had been a ghost in his mind for years, but now it stood before him, demanding to be acknowledged. And Natalie, her voice, her features, they dragged buried memories to the surface with an almost physical force. 25 years. That was how long it had been since Helen left, her departure shrouded in the silence of shame and avoidance. Wayne closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. Grace had left soon after, and Randy had followed her, their lives spiraling out of this house and into the void of elsewhere. He had done nothing to stop it, nothing to help Helen. And now, staring into the whiskey's still depths, he realized there was no escaping the weight of that failure. Natalie remained restless, the fragments of the past gradually coming together, yet they failed to form a comprehensive picture. She carried Amber to the nursery, settling her gently into the crib. Her fingers brushed her daughter's soft cheek as the baby stirred, but stayed asleep. The vulnerability in Amber's peaceful face reignited Natalie's resolve. She couldn't let this mystery rest. Returning to the library, she found Harold still seated, his expression thoughtful. He gestured for her to sit again, his voice quieter now. "I've been thinking. My mother, Susan, she always controlled what could and couldn't be spoken about in this house. If Helen's departure was sudden, it must have been under her watch." Natalie's lips pressed into a tight line. "And she refused to talk about your aunt and uncle?" "Completely," Harold replied. "I was told to forget they ever lived here." Natalie stared at him for a moment, trying to reconcile his genuine confusion with the calculated silence she'd sensed from Wayne. Why would someone try so hard to erase something unless it mattered? She murmured. Before Harold could answer, the study door creaked open, and Wayne entered. He looked older in that moment, the light casting harsh shadows across his face. His gaze shifted between Harold and Natalie before settling on the ledger. "I need to speak with both of you," Wayne said, his tone resolute but heavy. "It's time you knew the truth." Wayne sank into a chair, the weariness in his movements betraying the gravity of what he was about to say. He looked at Natalie first, then at Harold. "You're right. There are things I've kept buried for too long. About Helen, about Grace and Randy, and about this house." The room's atmosphere became tense, as if the walls were retaining their breath. "Helen was more than just a housemaid," Wayne began, his voice slow and deliberate. "And the reason she left wasn't what we told anyone. It was far more complicated than that." He hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor. "And it involved Randy." If you're listening to this and curious about the truth Wayne has been hiding for the past 25 years, leave a comment panna cotta to remind us of the devoted and lovely audience that's here. The dining room was eerily quiet that evening, the only sounds coming from the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Wayne sat at the head of the table, his shoulders heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Harold and Natalie faced him, the ledger lying between them like an accusation. Wayne cleared his throat, his eyes darting to Natalie before settling on Harold. "What I'm about to say won't be easy to hear," he began, "but it's time. I've been a coward, letting the past fester, thinking silence could protect us all. I was wrong." Natalie's grip on her chair tightened. "What happened to my mother?" she asked, her voice low but laced with steel. "What did your family do to her?" Wayne's lips pressed into a thin line. He exhaled slowly, his eyes reflecting the years of guilt that had etched themselves into his features. "Helen came to work for us when she was very young. She was bright, kind, and dependable. She became a fixture in this house." He paused, glancing at Harold, whose face was tense with confusion. "At the time, Grace and Randy lived here too." "Randy?" Wayne's voice faltered, and for a moment it seemed he wouldn't continue. But he forced himself to go on. "Randy was not the man we thought he was. He was cruel, selfish, and reckless. Helen became a target for his whims." Natalie's breath hitched, her expression hardening as the words landed. "What are you saying?" she demanded, though her voice trembled. Wayne's gaze dropped to the table. "One night, Randy hurt her. In the worst way a man can hurt a woman. She came to us, your grandmother and me, begging for help. But Susan thought only of the family's reputation. She dismissed Helen without a second thought, sent her away with nothing." Natalie's chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "You sent her away? After what he did to her?" Wayne flinched, but didn't look up. "I didn't stop it. I should have. I wanted to, but I didn't. Grace found out and left him. She was heartbroken, ashamed of what her husband had done. Randy followed her, but their marriage never recovered. Harold, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "You knew," he said, his tone incredulous. "You knew, and you said nothing." "I was afraid," Wayne admitted, his voice hollow. "Afraid of what it would do to this family, of what people would say. I thought if we buried it, it would go away. But it never did." Natalie's heart pounded in her chest, anger and disbelief warring within her. What happened to her after she left? Wayne's gaze shifted downward. "She disappeared from our lives. I didn't know where she went until years later. I heard she'd had a child. A daughter." Harold's head snapped up, his expression incredulous. "Natalie?" Wayne nodded, his voice barely audible. "The timing. It fits. Randy left soon after, following Grace to another city. Helen never came forward about what happened to her, and as far as I know, she never saw another man." The room fell silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Natalie stared at Wayne, her mind reeling. Every story her mother had told her, every moment of their lives together, suddenly had a darker shadow cast over it. "She never told me," Natalie said finally, her voice hollow. "She didn't say a word about this. She just raised me. Alone." Wayne nodded. "Helen was strong. I can't imagine the burden she carried, but she loved you. That much was clear." "That doesn't change anything," Natalie said sharply. "She suffered because of your family. She deserved better. And you gave her nothing." Harold turned to Natalie, his throat tight. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice pleading. "I didn't know any of this." Natalie's eyes softened for a moment, before they hardened again. "You didn't know, but you're part of this house, this family, and that means I can't stay here." "Natalie," Harold began, but she cut him off, her voice trembling. "No, I can't look at you, at this place, without thinking of what it took from her. From me." Her hand hovered protectively over her chest, as if shielding herself from the weight of the truth. Amber stirred in the other room, her soft cry piercing the tension. Without another word, Natalie spun around and headed towards the nursery. Harold sat frozen, his chest aching as he watched her leave. When she was gone, Wayne slumped back in his chair, the full force of his confession bearing down on him. Harold's hands curled into fists, his knuckles white against the polished wood of the table. "I have to make this right," Harold said, his voice firm despite the storm raging within him. Wayne shook his head. "You can't change the past." "But I can help her build a future," Harold replied, standing. His eyes burned with determination. "It's more than you ever did." Wayne didn't argue. For the first time, he seemed to realize there was no absolution for what had been done. Natalie moved through the guest room with quiet efficiency, packing her modest belongings into a worn duffel bag. Amber sat on the bed, gurgling softly, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of a blanket. The late afternoon sun slanted through the heavy curtains, casting the room in muted golden hues. To Natalie, it felt oppressive, the mansion's grandeur suffocating her with memories that didn't belong to her, but shaped her life all the same. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her mind, snippets of warnings and reassurances from years ago. Helen had been fiercely protective, yet never bitter. She had carried the weight of her suffering in silence, hiding the scars beneath a veil of quiet strength. But now Natalie understood the cost of that silence, how it had shaped not just her mother's life, but her own. She paused, one hand resting on the edge of the crib Harold had so thoughtfully arranged. A pang of guilt tugged at her chest. He had been kind, patient even. But the kindness of one man couldn't erase the cruelty of a family. Harold found her there, bent over the crib, tucking Amber's blanket snugly around her. He stopped in the doorway, the duffel bag catching his eye. His chest tightened. "You're leaving," he said quietly, though it wasn't a question. Natalie straightened, turning to face him. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "This house, this family, it's too much." Harold stepped into the room, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Natalie, wait. Please. I know what my family did was unforgivable, but don't let their mistakes drive you away from what we could." She shook her head sharply, cutting him off. "It's not just their mistakes, Harold. It's this place, this legacy. Everywhere I look, I see what was taken from her. How can I stay here, knowing she was thrown out like she didn't matter?" "You matter," Harold said, his voice cracking slightly. "Amber matters. I want to make things right." "You can't," Natalie replied, her tone softer now, but still firm. "You didn't do this, but you're part of it. I can't separate you from this house, this family, no matter how hard I try." Harold stepped closer, desperation lacing his words. "Then let me come with you. Wherever you go, let me help you. You don't have to do this alone." Natalie's resolve wavered briefly, her eyes searching his face for sincerity, but the weight of her mother's pain was too heavy to ignore. Finally, she whispered, "I've always done this alone. And I'll keep doing it. For Amber. For me." Harold's shoulders sagged, but he didn't press her further. He knew deep down that no words could change what she had already decided. From the hallway, Wayne watched silently, his face drawn and pale. He had intended to speak with Natalie one last time, to offer some final words of apology, but the sight of her packing was a stark reminder of his failures. He had spent decades living with the guilt of what he hadn't done for Helen, and now the consequences of his inaction were leaving this house once again. When Natalie emerged with Amber in her arms and the duffel bag slung over her shoulder, Wayne stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Harold followed closely behind, his face etched with sorrow. "Natalie," Wayne began, his voice unsteady, "I can't undo what happened. But, for whatever it's worth, I'm sorry. I should have done more for your mother. I should have protected her." Natalie looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's too late for that," she said simply. Wayne nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know." Amber let out a small whimper, and Natalie adjusted her hold on the child. She turned toward Harold one last time. "Thank you for helping us," she said quietly. "But I need to go." Harold's throat tightened, but he nodded. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice trembling, "I'll be here, always." Natalie hesitated, her defenses slipping for a brief moment. "Goodbye, Harold," she said, her tone tinged with a sadness she couldn't hide. Wayne stood by the window as Natalie's figure disappeared down the long driveway, the storm clouds overhead threatening to burst once more. Perched on the edge of the small town, like a mere afterthought, the inn was modest. Its wooden facade had weathered years of storms, and the faint smell of damp earth clung to the air. Natalie had found refuge there for the night, a stopover until she could figure out where to go next. Amber was asleep in the crib provided by the innkeeper, her tiny breaths the only sound in the quiet room. Natalie sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. The streetlights flickered against the encroaching fog, blurring the world outside. She had thought leaving the Tucker mansion would bring relief, but her chest felt heavier than ever. The weight of the truth about her mother, the anger, the sorrow, it all churned within her. A knock at the door startled her. She froze, her heart pounding. It couldn't be Harold. He wouldn't follow her, would he? She hesitated before crossing the room, and opening the door a crack. Harold stood there, rain dripping from his hair and coat. His expression was a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "Natalie, please," he said softly. "Let me talk to you." She sighed, debating whether to shut the door in his face, but something in his eyes stopped her. She stepped aside, letting him in. Harold entered, his presence filling the small room. He looked at Amber first, his gaze softening as he saw her sleeping peacefully. Then his eyes met Natalie's. "I couldn't just let you go." She folded her arms, her stance defensive. "Harold, I told you. I know what you told me," he interrupted gently. "But I can't let you leave like this. Not without saying what I need to say." Natalie's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Harold took a deep breath, his hands clenching at his sides. "I don't know how to make this right," he began, his voice raw. "I can't undo what my family did to your mother. I can't erase the pain they caused. But I can try. Try to do better. Try to be better." She shook her head, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You think that's enough? Words? Promises? Harold, this isn't something you can fix." "I know," he said, his tone steady despite the anguish in his eyes. "But I can't stand by and let you walk away without fighting for you. For Amber. For a chance to be in your life, however. You'll let me." Natalie turned away, staring at the small window. The rain had started again, the drops tracing erratic paths down the glass. "It's not that simple," she murmured. "I'm not asking for simple," Harold said, stepping closer. "I'm asking for a chance to prove to you that I'm not like them, that I can be someone you trust." Her shoulders stiffened. "Trust takes time." "I'll wait," he said without hesitation. "As long as it takes." Natalie turned to face him, her eyes searching his. For the first time, she saw the cracks in the polished image he had always projected. His vulnerability was laid bare, and it struck a chord she hadn't expected. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Harold parted his lips, yet the words seemed to pause in his throat. He looked at her, the weight of his emotions evident in his gaze. "Because I care about you," he said finally. "I care about Amber, and because I'm falling in love with you, Natalie. That's the truth." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, overwhelmed. The anger and pain she carried warred with the sincerity she saw in him. "Harold," she said, her voice trembling, "this doesn't erase what happened." "I know," he said, stepping closer but keeping his distance. "But it can be a beginning. Let me prove to you that you're not alone anymore. Let me prove that you can trust me." The room fell silent, the rain outside filling the space between them. Natalie closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. She wanted to push him away, to cling to the defenses she had built over years of struggle. But his words, his presence, chipped away at her resolve. "Trust takes time," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Harold nodded, his expression softening with relief. "Then I'll take whatever time you need." Natalie opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "You can stay, for now. But if you break that trust, Harold, there won't be another chance." "I won't," he promised, his voice steady. "I swear." Amber stirred in her crib, letting out a small whimper. Natalie moved to comfort her, and Harold watched, a faint smile touching his lips. For the first time, in what felt like years, hope glimmered in the corners of his heart. The study was dimly lit, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across the room's dark wooden paneling. Harold stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the city skyline. Wayne sat behind the large mahogany desk, nursing a glass of whiskey. The air between them was heavy, filled with words unspoken. "I'm leaving," Harold said finally, his voice steady but low. He turned to face his father. "Natalie, Amber and we're going somewhere else, somewhere far from this house, and everything it represents." Wayne looked at his son for a long moment, the lines on his face deeper than ever. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, then set it down with a quiet clink. "I thought you might," he said. His tone wasn't resigned. It was understanding. Harold hesitated. "This place, it's a weight. On her. On me. We need to start over." Wayne nodded, his expression somber. "I understand. You're doing the right thing, Harold. For her. For the child. And for yourself." Harold exhaled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. He hadn't been sure how Wayne would respond, but his father's support felt like a small victory. "Wherever you go," Wayne added, his voice softer now, "I hope you find peace. All of you." The sound of waves lapping against the shore greeted Natalie as she stepped out of the small coastal cottage. Bar Harbor was quiet in the early morning, the town still stretching awake under a pale sunrise. She inhaled deeply, the salty tang of the ocean air filling her lungs, and let her shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. Amber stirred against her chest, nestled snugly in a baby carrier, her tiny face pressed into Natalie's sweater. Behind her, Harold emerged from the cottage, his hands full with a basket of fresh laundry. He looked different here, the sharp suits and polished demeanor replaced by rolled-up sleeves and an easy smile. The way he had adapted to this slower pace of life was disarming, as if he was gradually shedding the layers of his old self. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm but tentative. "I thought we could head into town later, maybe grab some things for dinner." Natalie nodded, brushing a stray hair out of her face. "That sounds nice." After leaving the Tucker mansion for good, he had contacted an old colleague who owned the cottage and arranged for them to stay. The town was unassuming, nestled between rocky cliffs and endless ocean, far removed from the weight of family legacies and unspoken pain. The first few days had been awkward, marked by Natalie's wariness and Harold's careful attempts not to overstep. But slowly, the quiet rhythm of life in Bar Harbor began to work its way into their lives. Days were spent exploring the rocky beaches, picking up supplies from the local market, or simply sitting together on the small porch as Amber giggled at the seagulls overhead. In the evenings, Harold often took Amber while Natalie cooked. He would cradle her in his arms, speaking softly about anything and everything, a business deal gone wrong, a memory of his childhood, or how he was learning to let go of his past. Natalie would listen as she worked, her defenses gradually lowering as she saw how much effort he put into caring for Amber. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Natalie finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why did you leave it all behind? The mansion, the business, your father?" Harold was quiet for a moment, the ocean breeze ruffling his hair. "Because none of it mattered anymore," he said finally. "The house was never a home. The business, it was just a way to distract myself. And my father..." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He has to live with what he's done, but I couldn't let that be my legacy." Natalie studied his profile, the sharp lines softened by the faint glow of moonlight. "And what is your legacy now?" He turned to her, his gaze steady. "You and Amber," he said simply. Her breath caught, the sincerity in his words cutting through her doubts. She looked away, her heart warring with her head. Trust was still fragile between them, but in that moment, she felt its roots beginning to take hold. Life in Bar Harbor wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Harold took on various odd jobs around town, which surprised Natalie with his willingness to work hard. One afternoon, She came back from a walk to find him repairing the fence outside the cottage, Amber strapped to his chest in a carrier. She insisted on helping, Harold joked, gesturing to the baby who was gnawing on the strap of the carrier. Natalie laughed, the sound light and free, surprising even herself. As the days turned into weeks, Natalie began to notice the subtle changes in Harold. He was more patient, more open. The sharp edges of his polished exterior had softened, replaced by a quiet determination to be present, to be better. It was in the way he rocked Amber to sleep, the way he asked Natalie's opinion on everything from dinner to the cottage repairs, the way he never pushed her for more than she was ready to give. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Natalie looked over at Harold, holding Amber. "You've changed," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Harold glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe I've just finally found the person I wanted to be." Natalie didn't reply, but something in her chest loosened. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Bar Harbor became their sanctuary. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined their every moment. Together, they began to build something new, slowly, imperfectly, but with a quiet strength that carried them forward. The sunlight sparkled over the waters of Bar Harbor, waves rolling in gentle rhythms against the rocky shore. The small coastal town hummed with quiet life. Seagulls calling overhead, and a faint breeze carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. Natalie sat on the porch of their cottage, Amber gurgling happily in her lap as she swatted at a piece of driftwood Harold had smoothed down for her. The scene was peaceful, yet Natalie's thoughts churned as she caught sight of a figure approaching from the path leading to the cottage. Wayne Tucker walked slowly, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, his steps deliberate but uncertain. The years showed more starkly in his posture than Natalie remembered, his usually sharp expression tempered by something softer, regret, perhaps, or humility. Harold stepped out of the cottage with a toolbox in hand, pausing mid-stride when he saw his father. "Dad," Harold said, his voice a mix of surprise and wariness. He set the toolbox down, glancing at Natalie, who stood slowly with Amber in her arms. "I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome," Wayne said, stopping a few feet away. He looked at Natalie, his gaze holding hers. "But I needed to see all of you." Natalie didn't reply immediately. She searched his face, trying to reconcile the man who had let her mother suffer with the one who stood before her now. His shoulders slumped with the weight of years past. Finally, she nodded. "You're here now," she said quietly. "That counts for something." The afternoon passed in a strange, tentative calm. Wayne sat in the small living room, holding Amber with a reverence that surprised Natalie. He studied the baby's face as if committing every detail to memory. A faint smile softening his lined features. "She's beautiful," Wayne said, his voice breaking slightly. He looked up at Natalie. I hope she'll grow up knowing how loved she is." "She will," Natalie replied, her tone guarded but less sharp than before. She watched him closely, her walls still intact but showing small cracks. Later, Harold and Wayne stood by the edge of the beach, the waves lapping at their feet. Harold tossed a flat stone across the water, watching it skip before it sank. "I didn't expect to see you here," Harold said, his voice neutral. "I didn't expect to come," Wayne admitted. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, looking out at the horizon. "But I've been thinking a lot since you left, about everything. I had to see for myself if you were happy." Harold turned to him, his jaw tight. "I'm trying to be. Natalie's trying to be." Wayne nodded, his eyes heavy with unspoken emotion. "You've done well, Harold, leaving the mansion, building something real here. It takes courage." "It took losing her trust to find mine," Harold replied, his voice low. I'm not sure I'll ever fully earn it back, but I'll keep trying." Wayne looked at his son, pride and regret mingling in his expression. "You've become a better man than I ever was." As the day wound down, Wayne joined Harold, Natalie, and Amber for a walk along the beach. The golden light of the setting sun bathed them in warmth, the waves murmuring softly in the background. Amber sat perched on Harold's shoulders, giggling as he swung her gently with each step. Wayne walked beside Natalie, the silence between them less strained now. "I know I can't undo the past," he said finally, "but I hope, maybe one day, we can build something from it." Natalie glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It'll take time," she said, echoing her own words to Harold. "But I think we can try." Wayne smiled faintly, nodding. "Thank you." Ahead of them, Harold turned to face the horizon, Amber reaching toward the glowing sun, as if she could catch it. Natalie and Wayne joined him, standing together as the waves lapped at their feet. In that moment, the pain of the past didn't disappear, but it felt lighter. Together, they faced the vastness of the ocean, their shadows stretching long and intertwined, a quiet symbol of reconciliation, renewal, and hope. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.